Thanks so much for being with us, and I apologize if we were a little bit late. That's my fault. Carl and I were at a faculty meeting with the president of Harvard, and she was so interested and so impressive that we left a little bit late. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome my friend Lionel Barber, who is the editor of the Financial Times in London. He is here at my invitation because I'm convinced of two things. First, he's one of the most perceptive observers, not only of the European Union, which is his subject for today, but also of the U.S.-European relationship. He spent a lot of time in this country. In fact, he's been in this country on an extended tour the last couple of, well, he's been on a worldwide extended tour, which he'll tell you about, but been in this country for the last few days. And he's someone who knows both our business community, the financial sector, as well as our politics and our politicians. So I thought he'd be of great value at this school, and I want to thank him for being here. I also want to say that I think that senior journalists, and in Lionel's case, senior editors, they're diplomatic actors of the sort in the world today. And the 24-hour news cycle, the importance of the media, the importance of public diplomacy, the importance of public understanding of issues has accentuated the role of the media. And I certainly felt when I was in government that we had to pay as much attention to the media as we paid to other governments. And Lionel is someone I've known for quite a long time, and I think you'll see that his paper is right here, 3 copies right around today. He's someone who's practiced this art and this profession at the very highest levels. I said to my class the other day, when I encouraged them to attend this Lionel, that I felt in the English-speaking world, there are 3 great newspapers. And I don't know if you'd agree with this. Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. And the Financial Times is a distinct paper, very different from the other 2. And so I think you'll hear more about his paper today, but you'll also hear more about his subject. Can the euro survive? What are the implications of the euro debt crisis? What lessons should we Americans, perhaps, those of us who are American, draw from this crisis? And what impact will the euro debt crisis have on global financial stability? Lionel's already been in New York, and going back to New York, so he's been talking to some of our financial leaders about this subject. So it's a great pleasure to welcome him here today. He has prepared remarks for us, and then we'll have a discussion, question and answers from all. Lionel, welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome you.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. I'm absolutely delighted to be here again at the Kennedy School, and I was struck by Nick's remarkably generous comments about journalists and diplomats and how we are in some way diplomatic actors. I've always thought if that was true, then we are the ones who execute or pursue what might be called the drive-by foreign policy. The we don't always think of the long term or the medium term or short termists, but we do have to do our job with some responsibility. We can talk about that later. Now, when I originally talked with Nick, I said I'd like to give some kind of assessment, scorecard, if you like, of Europe's performance during the financial crisis. Then I thought, well, actually, I'm a British journalist by heart, so I think we need to be a bit more tabloid. So, can the euro survive? That's a modest. But actually, it's topical because euro pessimism these days is really rather infectious. Now, we know all about the sentiment in Britain. That's where the heart of Euroscepticism is. But I think I was struck recently by how much, or how far the disease has spread to places like India, just recently, on assignment. The Indian elite, I can tell you, is almost as dismissive and almost as China-centric as the chattering classes here in the United States. And the reason is because the charge sheet, if you like, against Europe, it runs something like this. The EU is institutionally blocked, insular, myopic, incapable of crisis management. Low-growth Europe is in secular decline in relation to the rising powers of Brazil, China, and India, and other emerging market economies. To borrow Bob Rubin's image, Europe is a little like a museum with splendid antique relics. Here, to my right, the French room devoted to social solidarity. Here to the left, the German room devoted to metal bashing and mass manufacturing. And over there, just where Carl's sitting, the Swedish room devoted to social democracy. R.I.P. In short, Europe looks politically and structurally incapable of adapting to the challenges of today, let alone tomorrow. And this year's Euro crisis has made Euro pessimism still more prevalent. A recent three-part series in the Financial Times, and that's the last advertisement over, because Nick's been way too kind. That series, written by a chap called Barber, he is a relation, formerly the Brussels bureau chief, highlighted the prolonged standoff over the rescue plan for Greece and the corresponding risk of a sovereign default spreading to Portugal, Spain and Ireland. And this in turn exposed profound weaknesses in the governance of the Eurozone and sharp divisions between the linchpin powers of France and Germany. More significant still, this Nick would of course remember from his time in Brussels, the crisis in Europe was averted only after timely interventions from outside, principally the United States and the International Monetary Fund. However, before I explore in more depth the origins of the crisis and the Eurozone's faltering response, I'd like everybody in this room to conduct a small thought experiment. Let's go back to 1994, 2 years after the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, which set out the conditions and timetable for monetary union. The newly named European Union had suffered 2 severe bouts of currency turbulence. The first led to the ejection of the UK and Italy from the exchange rate mechanism, and 1 year later to the creation of wider bands for currency fluctuation within the ERM. So wide, in fact, that they were dubbed not bands but boulevards. I remember this period vividly because I was the FT's chief European correspondent in Brussels. I spent many a night, and actually many an early morning, watching and reporting on efforts to restore confidence in the shattered EMU project. It really did, from an outsider's perspective, look a forlorn task. At one point, I remember this very well, Kohl, Mitterrand, Aznar and others couldn't even agree on a name for the single currency. Crown, Ducat, Écu, Euromark, Florent, they all went their separate ways before leaders finally settled on the rather prosaic name Euro. Yet, within 4 years, the EU had designated 11 founding members of the single currency and executed a seamless transition to notes and coins by 2002. No mean political and technical achievement. Now, all this by way of prelude to this year's drama. The financial crisis has laid bare 3 basic flaws in Europe's single currency project. 1, weakness in the enforcement mechanisms for fiscal discipline among Eurozone members. 2nd, the conceit that there could be no bailout mechanism for fiscal delinquents. 3rd, the lack of effectiveness of the much vaunted peer review process and collective surveillance by the European Commission. Let me deal with these in turn. Under the German-inspired Stability and Growth Pact agreed ahead of the launch of the euro in '99, member states were obliged, everybody knows this, to keep their budget deficits below 3% of GDP in all but exceptional circumstances, or they were due to face sanctions, including fines. But in 2003, France and Germany, themselves transgressors, agreed that the Pact's strictures need not apply to them. Jean-Claude Trichet, the President of the European Central Bank, is not the only one to argue that the European Central Bank, is not the only one to argue that the Franco-German circumvention was disastrous in terms of fiscal credibility and Eurozone governance. It spelt out an uncomfortable truth, a 2-tier Europe with one law applying to the big countries and very much another for the small. And I see a representative of Luxembourg in the audience who's nodding vigorously. Now, as for the fate of the no bailout clause in the Maastricht Treaty inserted at Germany's insistence, as the price of surrendering the treasured Deutsche Mark? Well, to paraphrase Harold Macmillan's words, that fate was sealed by events, dear boy, events. Once Greece teetered on the brink of default, a collective rescue had to be mounted, or else the entire project was deemed at risk. Only the terms had to be agreed, and though the bargaining was ferocious in April and May, it ended in a new EU institutional facility, the European Financial Stabilisation Facility, as well as, of course, bilateral financial aid to complement the IMF package. Finally, the crisis has exposed flaws in the peer review process, which put disproportionate emphasis on fiscal discipline at the expense of equally relevant criteria, such as current account deficits. So the likes of Greece and Spain were awarded the equivalent of gold stars for bringing their deficits temporarily under the 3% target. Of course, Greece admitted later that it had only met the criteria by falsifying the data. A novel approach to economic management. Equally seriously, and this is a very important point, no one was paying sufficient attention to excessive consumption and the attendant current account deficits. The reason, of course, lay in the false convergence between bond yields post-EMU launch, which left Greece and other Club Med countries, I promised to use that term once, borrowing at rates little higher than Germany, and investors chasing yield, leading to large speculative inflows, higher wages, and a loss of competitiveness. More broadly, the problems were compounded by exploding private sector debt and property bubbles in Ireland and Spain. And in this respect, it's worth asking whether the low interest rates set primarily for Germany's benefit in the early years of the euro merely exacerbated the problems of the peripheral member states and highlighted how the eurozone is far less than an optimal currency area. Now, the global financial crisis, of course, has spared no one, from Wall Street investment bankers, Dubai sheikhs, Russian oligarchs, the City of London, Financial Times pundits, even the maestro himself, Alan Greenspan. But it has struck Europe especially hard because it's coincided with a period of weak political leadership, which has made crisis management even harder. Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany and President Sarkozy of France are losing popularity and are frequently at odds. This goes beyond a well-documented mutual distrust bordering on antipathy. As one senior German official told me in Berlin recently, yes, the Chancellor receives 5 policy ideas from the Elysee before breakfast, and they all end up in the waste paper basket by lunchtime. As George Soros has written in an excellent article in the New York Review of Books, the Euro crisis has indeed led to a crise de conscience, or perhaps, Carl, I should say, Gewissensbisse, in Germany. The Maastricht Treaty specifically banned bailouts, and that ban has been upheld by the German Constitutional Court. But that is precisely what has actually happened. There has been a bailout. And pardon my French, again, but the German public feels duped by a bunch of feckless Greeks. Politically incorrect, but I'm at heart, it's still one. Elsewhere, weak political leadership is tangible in Italy, where Silvio Berlusconi is still preoccupied with preserving his parliamentary immunity against corruption charges. In the Netherlands, a new coalition supported externally by the far-right, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, immigration populist Geert Wilders looks unstable at best. And the nationalist right has also gained ground in Belgium, Sweden, and enjoys broad support in former communist countries of Central Europe. And meanwhile, in Spain and Portugal, Messrs. Zapatero and Socrates look to be in some serious political trouble. Paradoxically, the one country outside the Eurozone, Britain, looks to be a relative haven of stability, despite having embarked on the first full-scale coalition government in more than 70 years. Though, and this is a big though, the big test on public spending cuts is still to come. Now, I'm conscious at this stage that I'm sounding a little Eurosceptic myself. So let me offer some positive counterpoints. While the euro, in my view, the survival of the euro, is not a given, there are a number of reasons for cautious optimism in the short to medium term. And by that, I mean an unscientific 5 to 7, 8 years. Because as for the long run, I am indeed one with Keynes when he said in the long run, we're all dead anyway. The primary cause for guarded optimism is that the Eurozone did pull through the heat of the sovereign debt crisis. Of course it's far from over. We're still in a certain phase. We can talk about the various iterations of this financial crisis. But the 750 billion euro war chest, or rescue fund, has given countries a breathing space, even if the disputes over how the facility will work in practice are still unresolved or unclear. Moreover, there is some cause to agree with the verdict of the EC board governor, Lorenzo Bini-Smaghi, who opined that financial markets overshot in their enthusiasm for convergence in the Eurozone in the early part of the decade, and have since overshot in their skepticism regarding the lack of convergence between the German core in the Eurozone and the Club Med countries, I did use that phrase, in the periphery. Second, all member states are taking extraordinary measures to tackle not just their fiscal deficits, but also deeper long-term challenges such as pension deficits arising from an aging population and low birth rates. And whilst it is tempting, actually it's more than tempting, to focus on President Sarkozy's travails with street protesters as he seeks to raise the pension age to a modest 62, it's still worth taking a hard look at the crisis measures being pushed through in Greece and Spain, amongst others. In Greece, for example, tens of thousands of tax evaders are being finally brought back into the net. In Spain, the government is finally tackling labour market rigidity characterised by excessively generous severance pay when people are made unemployed. And finally, in Ireland, individual public sector pay has been slashed by up to 20%. It's not great if you're a postman in Ireland. Third, a semblance of agreement, I use that phrase carefully, is taking shape on the new rules governing the Eurozone. Yes, of course, there's plenty of wrangling, particularly over German demands for enforcing fiscal discipline. But as my colleague Martin Wolf has pointed out, Berlin's insistence on automatic fines is and will remain politically unrealistic in a hybrid political structure like the European Union, where power is shared between semi-supranational institutions such as the European Commission and national governments. And incidentally, when it comes to automatic fines, I can still remember discussing these same swinging German demands with the former Luxembourg central bank governor, Pierre Jans, back in 92-93, who described these demands, or the automatic fines, as the equivalent of a medieval torture chamber. And my response, having read my Brecht, was that they might indeed work if they emulated the treatment of Galileo before the Spanish Inquisition. The free-thinking scientist, we should recall, recanted, but only after being shown the instruments rather than having them applied to various parts of his anatomy. Moreover, Germany last week made an important concession to France by agreeing that sanctions would be less automatic than foreseen under the Commission's proposals. It's interesting to note that this caused the ECB to take an unprecedented step of publicly disassociating itself from the Franco-German deal. And over the past 2 weeks, the ECB has stopped its emergency programme of buying euro area government bonds, which could easily be seen as a warning to governments not to assume that the ECB will be a soft touch in the future. Several governments, such as the Netherlands and Sweden, moreover, were just as appalled as the ECB at Germany's concession to the French. However, step back, I would suggest that this to and fro means that in the short term, the Eurozone's response will be to muddle through. Outsiders, political scientists and others, will find this particularly frustrating because they would prefer far neater solutions for Europe, such as a fully fledged federal political construct to balance the federal monetary union. But, ladies and gentlemen, that's not the way it is in Europe, because for more than 50 years, Europe has defied such categorization. Culture, history, yes, the nation state have proved far too potent. European unity has existed, yes, thrived through diversity. So I would conclude by offering 3 scenarios for the euro going forward. Scenario A is that member states, led by France and Germany, agree that the status quo is indeed unsustainable, and that the Eurozone has to evolve to encompass fiscal transfers. These may be governed by tougher conditions, such as temporary suspension of voting rights and/or semi-automatic fines. Don't ask me what semi-automatic is. Fines, but very carefully, conditions set out. Now, this is the logical conclusion of categorical, if not necessarily credible, statements in European capitals that there can be no question of a sovereign default by Greece. Scenario B is that the euro survives, but the present eurozone does not. That is to say, Greece finds it impossible to service its debts. Entirely possible, by the way, given that in the short term, debt is due to rise despite efforts to rein in the budget deficit. A Greek default would then be accompanied by the abandonment of the euro and the introduction of a flexible exchange rate to facilitate adjustment. A smaller, more tightly, I almost said more perfectly formed, more tightly formed eurozone would, however, survive and be built around the Franco-German core. Scenario C might be described as the Armageddon option, whereby the eurozone collapses in its entirety. Now, this rests in part on a view of German policy 20 years after unification. In a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, the Germans, under this scenario, simply declare that they have run their economy brilliantly and see no needs to make the kind of adjustments that the majority of the Eurozone members would like to see. The compromises which have consistently underpinned European integration for the past 50 years post-EU would, under this scenario, prove impossible to sustain. Now, earlier in this talk, I invited the audience to conduct a minor thought experiment. So let me call upon your indulgence to just one more time to have another little thought experiment. In this time, a scenario whereby Germany withdrew from the euro to re-establish, in effect, the old D-Mark zone. In this case, the Deutschmark would go through the roof, and Germany's export-led economy would suffer, with corresponding soaring unemployment. The single market would begin to unravel as other countries would be tempted into competitive devaluations. Europe, under this scenario, would then resemble, well, let's think about it, would resemble perhaps the Confederation of the Rhine in the Napoleonic era, a group of self-important principalities caught between the rival powers of France, Austria, and Russia. That's Prussia. In this case, fast forward, we would have a Europe of nation states caught between the US and China, with a brooding Russia on its eastern border. I would submit that this makes an uncomfortable prospect at best, this Europe of principalities. And it shows that however powerful the force of economics, the politics behind the survival of Europe's single currency are not to be underestimated. So in my view, either scenario A or B is more likely. Categorical statements that the status quo must prevail and will prevail have no precedent in history, let alone economics. A Greek default may not be desirable, but it is by no means inconceivable. Similarly, the established patterns of bargaining and cooperation within the EU suggest that there is scope for further evolution within the Eurozone. Just to finish, there is, however, still one substantial caveat, and that is the absolute requirement that Europe returns to growth. This is the most important missing ingredient, and it depends on addressing the imbalances in the Eurozone between Germany and the rest of the Eurozone. As Soros has noted in his article in Europe Review Books, this will depend in turn on all countries tackling the solvency of banks, primarily through recapitalisation, but also a loosening of monetary policy to accompany the significant fiscal tightening underway. And this again will require an accommodation by Germany and a further adjustment in ECB policy. But the alternatives of a total collapse are spread, the alternatives to this accommodation of a total collapse of the Eurozone or a spreading sovereign debt crisis are far worse. So in that sense, I'm a cautious, very, very cautious optimist.
Lionel, thank you. Thoughtful, elegant, and provocative. So you've given us a lot to think about, particularly on the continent, and the future of Germany, France, and the other countries. I want to ask for questions, comments. I would just ask that you would let us know your name, perhaps where you come from, and every comment, intervention must end with a question mark. Cleanthus.
My name is Cleanthus Kyriakidis. I'm from Greece. So I did like very much your scenarios, to be the truth. But my question is about the foreign exchange market. And I would like to ask if the foreign exchange market really reflects or not the relative strength of currencies. Because the last 4 months, the euro gained something like 10 to 15%. So maybe the pessimism is not out there that much as was portrayed.
Well, first of all, I don't predict currency movements. I don't pretend to always understand them. But I would certainly argue that, relatively speaking, the recent strength of the euro is more a reflection of dollar weakness. And I also think that it's much, much more important, if you're assessing the strength of the economy at the moment, to look at bond yields. I wouldn't look at currencies.
Well, we're on the subject of Greece. Cleanthus is from Greece. Richard Parker knows a lot about this. I wonder if you wanted to really have a conversation with Lionel about whether or not you think there's sufficient discipline in the Greek political system to sustain these dramatic reductions in the budget, the fact that more people now need to pay their taxes. I mean, isn't that a variable that we've got to look at if we look at a possible Greek default? I'm
sure that the professor is much more an expert than myself. I can only give you the Greek perspective. We have some very painful reforms right now, and I would definitely admit that we had this tax evasive mentality in the past, and slightly or much, depending on how you see it, corrupt government. But definitely I think we are in the right path. If we will survive along with the euro, I don't know. And I leave that to the professor for predictions.
Sorry, the professor who knows everything. I'm Richard Parker, and I'm an advisor to Prime Minister Papandreou, and I'm not a Greek American, but I've been going back and forth steadily now for a year. I do think that Greece has made some very, very strong moves. They are taking hold. I think the mentality of Greeks has changed. The fact that the Prime Minister still maintains strong approval ratings, although not as strong as when he entered office, is testimony to me that the population is in general prepared to go through this crisis. When you talk about the failure of the Greeks to repay, I don't hear you talking about the option of restructuring, simply lengthening out the average term life of the bonds with appropriate adjustments in interest rates as a plausible alternative. I don't say this as a representative of the Greek government or that they're thinking about this, but some of us have observed that simply lengthening out maturities, which are right now running on an average of 4 to 5 years, would do an enormous amount to smooth out the hump that sits ahead of the 13 and 14.
Well, I think that is an option, and it certainly needs to be seriously considered. It couldn't possibly be raised as a prospect at this point because it would completely undermine any confidence in the financial markets. My question, and I really listened to the government, the finance minister, they come to lunch, the banks come over, they really want to make the case that these are extraordinarily, they're courageous actually, the measures that have been undertaken by the Greek government. And what a shame that they weren't undertaken earlier in the run-up to entry, but there we are. My question would simply be, one, the size of the debt. You're looking potentially at debt as a proportion of GDP getting to nearly 150%, right? Plus, still a very substantial budget deficit. Now, if the Greek government can both reduce its budget deficit according to IMF EU targets by the end of this year and continue through 2011 and gain confidence, gain credibility, that may give them a margin of maneuver, which they would need. But still, the problem then still is growth. Are they going to get the growth necessarily come back? And this is it's a very steep challenge. I would say if you can have an orderly restructuring in 2000, that is definitely an option. So I would agree with you.
Could I just make 2 comments? One, they are going to make their 8%.
They will this year.
This year, and it looks like they're going to make targets for next year, although obviously next year is next year. So the basis of the skepticism, given the extraordinary achievement to date, is
when I heard a senior representative of the Greek government say, well, of course, we are looking at the way we're measuring GDP.
Well, there are 2 things there. One of which is, if in fact 25 to 30% of actual GDP is not being recorded, one way in which these reforms will actually reduce debt as a share of GDP is to bring a large share of the underground economy on the books.
Yes. Yeah, that again, I would have so much more sympathy for that had we been confident in Greek data before. And that's a problem. But clearly, the black economy, both in Greece as in Spain, Portugal, and other countries, is a substantial component of output. How you exactly measure it, and how you present that case to the markets, interesting questions.
Intelligence just included it into the GDP.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. It's just
to the GDP.
I can't remember the exact
7%.
quote from former Commissioner Patton, who said you couldn't trust anything in Greece, even the length of the bus route from Athens to the marathon.
Given that the British deficit is approximately the Greek deficit, I think we should be cautious, or at least humble in a way that
No, we are.
Britain doesn't have.
Yeah, no, believe me, I'm not a spokesman of the British government, and we've got a big, big task to reduce that deficit. It's very high. Carl.
When Helmut Kohl came back from Maastricht with the euro and the abandonment of D-Mark, there was a revolt, as you will remember. The population didn't like it. There was a majority against it. And there was a fierce battle among 2 groups of economists. The monetarists who said, through the euro we will make fine. And there were the Krönungstheory, the coronation theory, who said the common currency can only come at the end of the economic integration and the coordination of politics. I signed with many of the monetarists at that time because there were 2 assumptions. Both turned out to be wrong. The one was that there would be such a convergence, slow convergence of the various countries, that we would arrive at a common base in social policy, fiscal policy. Slow, wrong, as we have seen from various cases, of which Greece, of course, is particularly striking, but it's not the only one. Secondly, we overlooked that there are other factors that you referred to, besides the fiscal deficit, the private debt that was loaded up, and the banking crisis that blew, that was so fierce. There was, of course, in the original arrangement, a certain distrust. The bailout clause says nothing else, but it may not work after all. There may be so much difference in the systems that it won't work, and we don't want to bail out. That's all. And the Constitutional Court, to which you rightly referred, something that is totally underestimated outside Europe, and indeed probably even outside Germany, the Constitutional Court maintained the no bailout. And Merkel was very worried that she would lose on this. And that's why she was extremely hesitant, which wasn't completely seen. Of course, there was this public, very awful anti-Greek reaction of the media, but that was a very important reason. And it stays around. The no bailout clause is still there. The logical conclusion is that the only way it can be resolved is that the convergence of the systems must be pushed by any available means, because you cannot maintain the system with, say, one country retiring at 55 and piling up debt, and some other countries retiring at 67, and then suddenly facing a crisis of the countries that live on the future. And that is what you call events, Macmillan. Events, young man, events. The event is now forcing even changing German thinking. The event is changing towards accepting le gouvernement économique that the French have always asked for. And that is why the muddling through, which you rightly refer, I think makes me optimistic. It's going in this direction. And that's the only way also to circumvent that awful obstacle that Merkel has in the no bailout clause judgment of the Constitutional Court. So it's going there.
Yeah,
We're going toward the French conception.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that interpretation. And it's also a reflection that, given events, the crisis, that the essential German construct, which was excessive concentration, just debt deficits, and a pro-cyclical policy, it just can't work. It needs to work. It needs to evolve.
Yeah.
It needs to evolve. But this is very tricky, given the current state of German public opinion, and as you say, the strictures of the Constitutional Court. So we'll have to have another Europe built by stealth.
Could you put one more framework on this talk, which is the financial markets? This has been a discussion to date of fiscal policy and government behavior. Which maybe you did before I got here, but I heard no reference to the larger structural issues of financial markets, lack of financial regulation, cross-market regulation, and the like, which does seem to have had some hand in
I sort of, yes,
the last few
of course, yes, I would agree. I mean, again, I was trying to focus more for topical purposes on Europe, because it's so easy that people say that this project's finished, whereas it's not. But I think people are very familiar with crisis exported from America. After all,
AIG Financial Services from London, but yes.
And you talked about being humble. I mean, I can tell you, there's a lot of humble people in the city of London. If you think the amount of the degree to which the British economy was reliant on revenues from financial services, we're having to really seriously look at it. But really, the most important comment that I would refer back to in this little talk was the ECB governor, Lorenzo Smart, who said, actually, the financial markets have had a tendency to overshoot, to overreact. I mean, it's unbelievable, the suspension of all critical faculties in the middle part of the decade. They just assumed, maybe they thought they could take the bet and win, that somehow bond yields there's a slight difference in spread between Spain and Germany. Well, not really, not if you looked at the actual performance and the underlying factors in the respective economies. It's similarly, you're now seeing suddenly Brazil performing slightly better or the same as Portugal. Well, it's a huge difference in the respective economies, but the financial markets, that's what they thought. So I think they've tended to overshoot.
Alex?
So I'm Alexandre Perez. I am a student here at the Kennedy School and at Stanford Business School. And well, several articles have been written in the Financial Times in the last weeks about the currency wars.
Yeah.
And in those argumentations, in those articles, in one of them there was a proposal about the need of a new international currency reference, which when you read through the argumentation, that argumentation applies to the reasons why the euro makes sense within the European Union. Beyond that, and without taking into account the reduction in transaction cost, reduction in debt, in cost of capital as a result of the euro, there is a political discussion, which is the diplomatic exercise between the different countries in Europe. And the point here is, could Germany afford at this time, after this project, let's say the failure of this diplomatic project of union between the different countries in the European Union? Because it's not only about the economic fundamentals that, of course, may support a reason towards a unified monetary union, but it's also this project of unification of the different countries in the region. And this is a cost that, by the way, if we put it into a context, the bailout of Greece is insignificant to the potential cost of the failure of this European project. So,
well, I think that was essentially what I was trying to argue. Giving a sense of that. You started with currency wars, and this is not a term adopted by the Financial Times. We've actually said there isn't a currency war. It just so happened that the finance minister of Brazil was the one who declared a currency war. So we didn't fire the first shot. As I said, actually, I don't think that they. What is absolutely clear is that the prospect of further quantitative easing by the Federal Reserve, even before it's actually happened, the anticipation has already generated huge flows of money into emerging market economies. I was in India, as I said recently, and the central bank there is very concerned about the effect on the exchange rate. And you've already seen some countries taking action to dampen the appreciation of their currencies, never mind the fact that equity markets are going up. So I'm inclined to sort of say at the moment regarding the American policy that John Connolly said that it's our currency, your problem. It's our monetary policy, it's your problem.
Martin Burkhardt, journalist with a newspaper in Denmark. Coming back to scenario C, which fascinates me. You were there, you described you were there at the crisis of the IM in the early 90s. Yeah, and I was wondering, I mean, Merkel has said, she said, I think just after the crisis in the spring, that if there's no euro, if the euro goes down, that's the end of the EU. You said something slightly different. You said that's the end of the single market, because that would bring about competitive devaluations. I was wondering, I mean, one tempting thought is if Germany gives up the euro and introduces the D-mark again, whether there would be any chance of the single market surviving with a new ERM?
The answer is no.
Why?
And well, first of all, again, my personal judgment is that Germany will not give up the euro. If you think of what is at stake, I've said there could be, and I'm not, again, let's be clear. We're not advocating that Greece defaults in a disorderly way. I'm not saying Greece is definitely going to have a risk. I think it may well be a restructuring, but there's a way of orderly restructuring, as you suggest. And the Eurozone, as I've tried to say, may revolve, but I do not believe in the Armageddon option. So I don't believe that we are going to go back to something like the ERM. Now, just in historical terms, having watched the likes of Chirac at European summits and what he did to the Italians over the depreciation of the euro, of the lira, when they were outside the euro, outside the ERM. I mean, you see this in your
I remember that.
Yeah, the end. This would be. I don't see how the single market would survive, and so therefore, it would all be. It would just gradually drift apart. But I don't see that. I really don't see that.
Could I add a little comment?
Sure.
German business, already at the time of the introduction of Europe, was becoming aware that the D-mark was too small a base for its activities. In the meantime, with the euro being around, you have such a powerful lobby in the German business world to maintain it. I don't see that either.
I think this is a really important point. I remember having a conversation in 1997 with a member of the Deutsche Bank executive board. And this was at a time, just as Karl's describing, where the German media would say, oh, we're losing our treasured Deutschmark, and what's going to happen to the poor old, the D-mark is the foundation of stability, and you'd have the odd populist politician, usually from Bavaria, sounding off, to use French. And I remember saying, I'm really struck by the degree, the depth of support within the German business community for the single currency. He said, you're absolutely right. Absolutely. And I said, why is that? It's not just about sentimental politics. They said, of course not. Because we want stability within the single market, but also, this is his words, he said, the single currency will be our way to smash the guild mentality in Germany. And if you look at what has happened, in terms of the guild mentality, if you look at what the degree of wage discipline exerted within Germany after the launch of the single currency, it is remarkable. The guild mentality, if not been smashed, it's certainly been applied a certain pressure to it. Yeah.
Yes, Jack.
You mentioned 3 scenarios. I was wondering if in the second scenario, it's a question because I don't know enough of the subject. If Greece exits in the second, like you proposed in the second scenario because it can't meet, wouldn't this launch a domino effect on, or increase the pressure at least on Spain, Ireland, and so on, because of the? Will it make it easier then for the financial market to be more wary about Spain and Ireland, and consequently that they crash? And in that sense, is it really a second possible scenario, or do we have only one?
Well, again, these are conceits. One tries to think about potential scenarios, you wouldn't have ruled it out. Of course, you're right, and that was why in the spring people were so nervous about letting Greece go, because at that time there really was a risk of the crisis spreading, and Spain. It's not just it's a very large domino, and the financial markets you've seen. If you remember, in the September 2008, the way in which the financial markets turned one after one on the investment banks, and it seemed, first of all, Merrill, Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch. By the end of the week, it would have been Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. And I think in the same way, you had that kind of herd instinct operating in the spring. So I agree with that. And there is a risk, but, and then this is where it would be interesting to spend a little bit more time and try to understand it. If there's a degree of credibility earned, and by the way, that's what the British government was doing, trust in the markets, then that might give you the space to have a restructuring, a debt management exercise, which would then prevent it from spreading to us. Yes, sir.
Jürgen Holmqvist, I'm on leave from European Commission. I share your cautious optimism. I'm actually optimistic, not just cautious. But there's one question I'd like to ask you. A number of these countries in the southern part of the Eurozone, they now have very high cost levels at the same time as we have a very low inflation environment. How do you think they'll handle their labor cost levels?
Well, that's
and then another thing just on the, it's true that the US exported the financial crisis to us, but we actually imported it, and not everyone imported it. So I think we had equal responsibility.
Yeah, no, I'm not trying to absolve the European, believe me, all responsibility. And the answer is that there is, given you don't have the option of exchange rate adjustment, it's going to have to come in the labour market. And that means lower wages and real wage cuts. If you look at the British position, we have a flexible exchange rate. We've really benefited from a effective devaluation in the last 2 years against the dollar and the euro. It's come back a little bit. Faced with unemployment, people have taken wage cuts or gone on short-time working. That's been the adjustment. And that's what's going to have to happen. And that's very difficult in some of these other countries. That's why when I interviewed Prime Minister Zapatero in Madrid, and he was being very evasive about a deeper, whether he was going to introduce another emergency program of cuts, which wouldn't commit himself. And I was getting rather frustrated in the Moncloa, as one does. And I said, I mean, there's only way, I've just got to get this guy's attention, because he just will not answer the question. Sure, he has this program. So I said, Prime Minister, I just got one question after this fascinating conversation. Do you believe that historians will look back on your premiership as the moment when Spain finally entered Division 2 in Europe, in terms of the economy? That got his attention.
How did he respond?
He said, he went white. No, please don't write this. And then we went for a little walk in the woods after the Moncloa, and he said two things. First, how is Tony Blair, my friend? And second, please, do you understand this country of mine? If we go too deep too soon, we'll have riots in the streets.
Right.
Sure.
So that you get right to the heart of you've glossed over our publics in a way, and so the one thing that I wrote down in scenario B was noyau dur. So this idea that, you know, even in the one thing that sort of kept the glue together in the widest sense, even if you had to lie and fudge and realign the stories, if you allow different speeds at every level and every policy area, and what story are you arguably still telling? You talked about the crisis of leadership. What story are we telling about Europe in terms of what story are we telling to the generation after and the generation after that no longer remembers in some respects why, quote unquote, we're even here?
Well, this is why I offered scenarios. I tried to suggest again, I don't think one could be categorical, I'm not that smart, by no means. I think we muddle through and we try to keep the so-called sheep together. We've got definitely a couple of pretty black sheep, and they're trying to turn white, so to speak. But we try to keep this together. And one of the most striking stories that I heard in the last 12 months was when the Prime Minister of Greece, when he stood up, he didn't stand up, he was at the meeting with all the heads of government, and he actually said, my country is corrupt to the bone. And he said, but I want to say, you know, I am so grateful to you, the Swedish chair. And then he spoke in Swedish. And he said, we're in this together. And actually, that is the message from this year for all the noise, and the turbulence, and the crisis. And the politicians have not really been able to yet articulate this fully, and
Exactly.
in a way they don't. But that's the reality of what's happening on the ground, inside the councils of Europe.
Can I just ask just a question to unite this discussion
Yeah.
with this country, the United States? So you've been discussing how Europe has managed the Euro debt crisis and the Euro crisis. From your perspective, how has the United States managed this crisis? And as we emerge from it, hopefully, are we a little bit weakened in terms of our economic power and credibility? What impact do you think that's going to have on Europe?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would give 5 out of 10, and nobody managed this crisis well in the early phase. The Bush administration, by the way, it's not just the Bush administration, it's the Congress too. Given that the system is biased towards inaction, given you had a completely irresponsible Congress, where they were not prepared to accept the measures, finally did. Maybe that was the finest constitutional hour where you had a House of Representatives vote, which said no, and then when they saw the financial markets reaction, they said yes, and TARP did work. TARP, remember, was a first iteration. The most important thing that happened was the recapitalization of the banks. And in that respect, then things start to get better in the management of the crisis. The stress tests conducted early, Europeans were way later on that, and nowhere near as credibility. And I remember having, again, lunch in Paris with some of the leading industrialists and the bankers, and a French banker saying, this stress test is purely a marketing exercise. Which I said, yes, correct. that's the point. So they were late. I think so I would give fairly high marks in 2009, sorry. What is striking is how the weakness of the American economy at this point. People earlier this year were thinking things were pulling out, unemployment, though high, was starting to come down, and that maybe the economy would come through, and that's just not happening. And maybe now it's seeing not another leg down, there's far too much talk about a double dip, but a very long period, 5 years of flattish growth. And this comes to your point, Nick, about economic strength. The fact is, post-bubble, America, relatively speaking to the rest of the world, is a weaker actor. It's not the end of the superpowers. This is, again, overblown talk, but relatively speaking, weaker. And crucially, we were just beginning to talk about this earlier. I think this is a very important point. America beginning to understand in the corridors of power that they no longer have a new monopoly on the exercise of economic power. They can't just say, well, they have to take account of China, foreign exchange reserves, purchase of the bond market, in the bond market, currency policy. They have another actor to deal with. And then second, just think about this. If, for example, this period of flattish, sluggish growth continues, and someone says in the Congress, well, we're going to have to therefore take protectionist measures, serious protectionist measures, selective but serious, Europeans are not going to support this. They may denounce them. Again, it's happened a bit in the past, but it's different. So, relative speaking, America is a weaker, much weaker actor after the bubble.
Two final questions.
Yeah, I'm Katya Kantor, a student, MPA student here at the Hurricane School. I'm not a financial specialist of Europe at all, but I do want to make a link to what I have researched, and I quite know the situation from my journalist background as well. I recall a statement is that like when there is a crisis in a project, the only thing that can save this project is people's desire to save it, which means people's feelings of belonging, of attachment to that project. So that's generally saying an identity to that project. And when I made a dissertation in the UK, I researched the media influence on forming or impeding political identities, and I chose the European identity. So I researched the UK media, on coverage of EU enlargement, big enlargement in 2004, right? Which was supposed to be a very, very significant historic event meant to explain more about the event and to test the European feelings, like where the project is going. So it was an opportunity for the media to contribute to that. Instead, what the UK media did, my findings were, it was like overwhelmingly negative coverage of that event, focusing primarily on immigration, actually boosting hostilities to an unprecedented scale. So what I found there, it was the media just screwed up all the opportunities. Even from a professional point of view, they had the duty to have another perspective on the issue. So what I thought there, and my conclusion was that this European Union project was always elite-driven, and the elites didn't bother about communication with people, so they left it to the media. And the media, of course, jumps and takes the issues that it wants due to selling effects. I mean, the bad news is the good news.
So your question is the British media irresponsible?
No, my question is that European Union elite now is just reactive, that whatever crisis is happening, it will deal with no support, and it will be much more difficult to do that. So do you see a link in gathering more support and more connection between elites and people?
I mean, I can't. There is the different forms of news media in Britain, not just the popular press. I referred to earlier where British general mood is towards Europe. It's not going to be a cheerleader. There's innate, if not skepticism, sometimes hostility. Age-old images, Churchill's wheeled out every 6 months. This is all true. But what I actually say to politicians in Britain is, why do you take the British media so seriously? I can't believe how you agree to be berated on the radio early in the morning. I mean, this is unbelievable. Or why do you think you can't go to send a minister to Brussels because, or to India, when Cameron's just gone there talking about a new special relationship, and you say everybody has to be. I mean, this is. But that's maybe part of it.
Media do what
they do, but we're not going to be cheerleaders. We should be intelligent critics, sympathetic critics.
Last question.
I wanted to ask you just something about kind of cultural or tone changes. I'm very struck when you speak by how, what should I say, how Protestant you sound. All this enthusiasm for, squeezing the unions and making people work longer, and as though this is like, good for us all. We have to pull up our socks. And of course, it was very interesting the other day seeing, the decision by the Brits to make all these cuts, the death of Keynes. And I'm wondering, in Europe as a whole, you travel around a lot. What's going on? Is everybody deciding that the age of Keynes is over and we all have to, get back to being dour and, wearing the same shoes for 5 years? What's going on there?
Well, first of all, if you read the FT, you can see there's a broad church debate here. Someone like Sam Britton is just every week he's denouncing the government's policy of severe cuts in public spending and the deficit. Martin Wolf is somewhat sceptical, but particularly concerned about the speed and depth of the cuts. It's tricky. You could just push the economy back into a recession. Overall, with some caution, qualified support, we're saying, gentleman here is saying that if you've got a deficit of 12% of GDP, that's a big debt. You can't just live with this. You've got to do something. So the question is, how do you set out a credible timetable? I'm sorry if I came across a Protestant. I'm actually non-denominational. But I'm just reasonably, I'm not an economist, but I spent enough time talking to people and understanding that the financial markets are extremely powerful. They can cause a lot of damage. So maintaining a degree of confidence is important, and that means maintaining some credibility in terms of how you're going to deal with this deficit. But it doesn't mean to say, I'm a Grinch. You couldn't be the editor of the pink paper.
And the weekend edition is very Keynesian in consumption.
So don't take it off, there is a period of austerity which we're going to have to undergo because of the debt that we've accumulated. And remember, if you've been either present or just an occasional entrant in the kind of wild party we've had in the last 20 years, you'd understand why a little bit of sobriety doesn't do anybody any harm.
Sarkozy would agree with you, but his people doesn't.
That's true.
Lionel, I called the last question. There's been a suggestion that China, a word about China, Jack?
A question about China, because of the New York Times article today about the Obama administration, the way it's handling China, there's kind of a shift, a bit of an aggressive, a little bit more aggressive than it was discussed yesterday. And we were having that debate about, it all starts with the currency problem and the devaluation of China, obviously, and the world getting frustrated with China not moving at all on that level and the problem it caused. And then I remember the interview of on CNN, the Indian reporter, the friend, the commentator of CNN, he's a friend of yours. Zakari.
Yes.
Had an interview with Zhabao, the Prime Minister of China, in which the Prime Minister said, anyway, even if we evaluate our currency and we do what the Americans say, it's not going to contribute to the American economy in any way. It's not going to contribute to the American economy, it's going to contribute to our neighbors' economies and improve them because of the quality of the products and the competitions and so on, and the type of, Americans don't produce T-shirts anymore, so they're not going to export them to China just because the currency is more expensive. So, what would you have to say about that? Because it's very current.
Well, it's a big question, but and a big topic. But what I would say is, first of all, the Chinese will not revalue their currency under open American duress. They'll look politically, and they're extremely concerned on the political side, less so than perhaps the technocratic central bank side, about a rapid appreciation of the currency, because they think that this would just simply price Chinese factory workers out of the market. They're very worried about that, and they higher unemployment, and they higher unemployment. And the Americans have, I believe, just the head of the G20, I think the Chinese may move, but it will be incremental, very small. They'll just do enough to show that they're doing some things, but it won't solve the problem. And the challenge for the Americans is somehow, with other support, to show the Chinese that it's actually in their own interest to revalue. Because if they're serious about Chinese workers and Chinese employers moving up the value chain and increasing wages, then revaluation is part of that dynamic. So it's less the question of zero-sum game, who's exporting to whom, who's consuming. It's going to be phrased and framed in a different way.
Lionel, thank you very, very much.